Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Front Page Fitness. I am Eric Trexler. I am here with the Dr. Lauren Colenso Semple with yet another episode. Lauren, how you doing tonight?
So right before we started recording, I had fish tacos with this diabolical hot sauce that I've never tried before. That was a mistake. Do not recommend. So if I look like I was just crying, that's why. Not because of all the hate comments I've been receiving online.
Yeah, and when you're having a sandwich like a taco, you really got to be careful about what kind of hot sauces and salsas might go into it because some of them pack a punch. So definitely one of the more aggressive sandwiches, potentially.
Listeners have spoken, and they're totally on my side. Read the definition of sandwich.
Well, the law's not on their side, so they should lawyer up, is all I have to say. All right, so Lauren, it is not a secret. People generally dislike you. They find you to be highly unlikable, mostly wrong, very aggravating. So this is becoming a weekly segment of why people hate Lauren on the internet. So what do we have this week?
So this week, I made a very big mistake. I commented on a post by Dr. Mary Claire Haver. Mary Claire Haver is a menopause influencer, but, highly accredited doctor, if you ask her. And she also happens to sell weighted vests along with supplements, and she is the creator of the Galveston diet. A lot of really quote-unquote evidence-based things. You'll also find her on social media with, the green screen in the background with the article and saying, I'm a scientist, which she isn't a scientist, not a trained scientist, but supposedly extremely evidence-based.
Is she a medical doctor? Where's the
She's a medical doctor.
Okay.
Yeah, she's an OB-GYN.
Okay.
And
I just want to say, I know we get in trouble every time we talk about locations, but the Galveston diet, as in like Galveston, Texas?
I don't know if it actually has a relationship to Galveston, Texas, but one might think.
Because that's not a particularly glamorous, you have like the South Beach diet, or like the Mediterranean diet. It's always a place where you're like, oh man, a day in the Mediterranean, eating olives, drinking wine. I don't think put me in Galveston, 95 degrees, infinite humidity, probably caught in a traffic jam. I'm not sure if the Galveston diet really gives me the romantic, charming ideas that make me want to consume it. But anyway, go on.
That's a very good point. And I don't know the origin. It's definitely something that we should dig into.
Yeah.
But she's also the founder of The Pause Life and a member of the Menopause. A lot of really, really good stuff for.
Again, I'm sorry, I don't keep chiming in, but I feel like her marketing team is off the mark here because The Pause Life makes me sound like my life is completely in a rut. Things are not moving forward. I have no options. I'm just stuck. But anyway, go ahead.
And you will be if you don't buy all of the stuff she's selling.
I'm living that paused life. It doesn't sound like you're really, really cruising. But anyway, go on. I'm gonna try to reserve my.
Just try to keep an open mind.
Yeah.
So she's constantly promoting these weighted vests, saying they're rooted in science, and this is walking with a weighted vest for, let's say, 30 minutes. I commented on this post because I recently did a dive into the weighted vest literature for bone, for muscle, for fat loss, and found that this data really doesn't look good for any of those particular outcomes. And just briefly, the studies we're talking about, one that is very, very commonly cited, 9 women wore a weighted vest and did jumping exercises. The other 9 did nothing, and they did find some benefits in the women that were doing something. Now, of course, we can't tease out the weighted vest versus the jumping exercise, and there was no weighted vest walking. When we move into some of the other literature, we're talking about people wearing weighted vests for 8 to 10 hours per day. Again, not a 30-minute walk with a weighted vest. And even then, the results that we see are just really not exciting, not very compelling. You're talking about women who are men and women wearing weighted vests for the whole day, and also on a calorie deficit, and or just on a calorie deficit, and they lost the same amount of weight. And just wearing the weighted vest, no calorie deficit, a heavy weighted vest, they lost about 1.6 kilograms. The lighter weighted vest, they lost about 0.3 kilograms body weight. And everyone complained about lower back pain. Everyone said it was uncomfortable. Clearly, this is not a very feasible, practical strategy.
Yeah.
And then there's a couple of trials that were pilot studies, meaning they were never designed to, intend for recommendations to the public. Similar duration of wearing the weighted vest. The bone researchers are pretty angry about this because they're saying, hey, you guys, the purpose of this was to determine the appropriate calculation for the necessary sample size we would need to actually run the major study. It wasn't to do your statistical analysis on this really small sample to then for people to go and read in the abstract on PubMed to justify the use of the weighted vests. All that to say, armed with this knowledge, I commented very respectfully, actually, keep in mind these people in these studies were either also exercising or they were wearing the weighted vests for a really, really long duration, 8 to 10 hours. We don't have any data showing that taking a walk with a weighted vest is going to be beneficial for bone, muscle, or fat loss. She deleted my comment instantly.
Beautiful.
I got mad.
Yeah.
And was I a little bit petty? Yes. Do I regret it? No. I made several more comments. And I commented on some of the other comments. And she deleted those as well. And so then I commented, why are you deleting my comments? Why can't we discuss the science? Now, there are so many comments on that I don't dare read all of them for my own mental health. But let's just say, I'm a terrible person. I'm attacking another woman. I'm a nobody trying to get famous from attacking the great Dr. Haver. And, I should probably just go away because who the hell am I?
Yeah, I mean, they make a lot of good points.
Totally.
But no, it's interesting because back in the day, I don't think you were able to, I don't even know if you're able to now, probably not. Back in the day, like evidence-based fitness happened on Facebook, or it happened in forums back in the day, internet forums. And those were actually good for this kind of discourse because you did not have the power or authority to delete other people's comments, even though it was your post. Instagram is really good for letting people curate exactly the kind of comments that they want on their posts. They can delete stuff they don't like. And so this is a place, there was a person who got canceled for doing really bad things in the fitness world many years back. And they basically just vacated Facebook and went to Instagram because every time they posted on Facebook, people would be like, you're a terrible human being, go away. And when they went on Instagram, if you looked at their posts, everyone would be like, this is great content. Thank you very much. Because everything else they were just deleting. So it's really good for people who have been severely canceled to like just go strictly to Instagram for being able to curate the comments. And also for people who very much do not want to engage with the science whatsoever. So unfortunately, it looks like you were bearing the brunt of that. And so now there's just a bunch of people hating you in the comments there, but probably the original reason for them hating you is like a mystery lost to time.
Right.
Yeah.
I was just trying to be helpful because I went to the post, I saw a bunch of comments and it was saying, mine is really uncomfortable. I'm experiencing so much back pain. Is there anything else that I can do for my bone health? Is there anything else I can do to build muscle? And I'm like, oh, what is happening? Sorry.
Yeah. Well, that's a bummer.
Yeah.
I don't want to pile on and kick you while you're down, but obviously before we recorded, I was mocking you mercilessly. I felt that the choice of an all black sleek top was very much a power move, like a The term I used was Steve Jobs, but you corrected me and mentioned Elizabeth Holmes, who basically modeled her persona after Steve Jobs. So I kind of was mocking you for doing the Elizabeth Holmes kind of, CEO, startup founder kind of vibe.
To
And
be
that
clear,
reminds
this is a lightweight, like sweater-ish black top, not a tight turtleneck. But go on.
I don't know what to tell you. For whatever reason, people on the internet see you post and they want to say nasty things, and
And
you aren't
you're
all
part
of
of
that.
that crew now.
Yeah, I think that's another. So at a certain point, it's kind of you more so than it is any of us. Like if it's a common enough thing. But that reminded us some news that we didn't actually address on the show. A headline that we skipped over. I almost texted you when I saw this and I forgot to. But we've talked about. I think we've mentioned Elizabeth Holmes on the show, one of our first episodes, if I'm not mistaken. But she started a company called Theranos, which was like this magical company, too good to be true, where they would take a very, very tiny blood sample, put it in a big black box mystery machine, and it would give you all sorts of information about a zillion different health parameters. And that's, if you've ever worked in a lab, Lauren, we both have, getting blood samples, there's actually kind of a lot to it, like, if you've ever gone to the doctor, for example, and they take your blood and you're like, why are you taking 4 different tubes? Like, do you really need that much blood from me? And the answer is almost certainly not. But usually what they need is blood that's mixed with this inner coating with a particular chemical and blood that's mixed with that inner coating, different things that promote coagulation, reduce coagulation, help you spin it down to get plasma versus spinning it down to get serum. Just a lot going on within the chemistry of collecting a viable blood sample for a particular assay to estimate a particular blood parameter. Now, that's why Elizabeth Holmes, when she came out with this company, she's like, yeah, give me like a couple drops of blood. I'll give you like a zillion outcomes. Everyone's like, oh my God, how is she doing this? And she was in the like Forbes list of, whatever it is, 30 under 30 or 40 under 40, whatever, which is really like a perfect predictor for fraud. Like if anyone were like to say, hey, Eric, you're still under the mark. We want to put you in the Forbes 40 under 40. I'd be like, I can't handle that heat. I don't need people coming after me with all the fraud investigations. I'll probably get audited. I don't want anything to do with that list. Not that anyone's knocking down my door to put me on it. But anyway, she was put on that, and she is definitely one of the examples where, hey, what do you know? It was kind of the canary in the coal mine that she definitely absolutely was committing fraud. she's currently serving like, I think, an 11-year prison sentence. But good news. If you look past all the fraud and the fact that the technology never was created and never worked, and you still have a lot of hope and optimism when it comes to Elizabeth Holmes et al. Doing blood testing, the headline is that her partner, Billy Evans, they've been engaged since 2018, is currently raising funds for a new company that's going to do blood testing, Lauren. So they are getting the gang back together. They're going to give it the old college try. And if you want to know how insane the world of, venture capital is, people are putting money into this project and investing in this. And, there's all the quotes, like I've seen quotes from the company. They're like, yes, we do know that our CEO's partner has been jailed for, fraudulently creating a company that aims to deliver on many of the same promises we are. But we don't think that's necessarily a problem. we don't think that's going to be a major challenge. It's just a higher bar to clear for us. And it's like, guys, come on, this is just get into a different line of work, right, Lauren? I mean, this can't go well, can it?
Yeah, you'd think even if they were going to launch some other shady business, they would try to venture into a different space. But I think, to your point, there's a reason why we take a lot of blood tubes, because even when you spin it down to get whatever the usable plasma or serum is, it's a much smaller portion of the tube, and then there's a certain amount needed to perform whatever the analysis is just to get a single hormone or so just it's a really nice idea and really implausible that they will be able to make this happen where you can do a pinprick and be able to get any more than your blood glucose.
Yeah. In case you were wondering, um, so because of in addition to Holmes's fraud conviction, there's a separate investigation by the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. And because of that, she is not able to serve as an officer or a director of any public company for a decade, starting in March 2018. But don't worry about it. The prohibition does not affect her ability to help run a private company. So, in the case that this company wants to bring her on board, not that they have, she's not planning to take a formal role, but if they really need to bring in the big guns, she is not prohibited by the SEC to jump in and help them deliver on the promise. Now, they say, here's a quote. Let's be good journalists here.
Okay.
The company said, the quote, "This is not Theranos 2.0." And that is what I would probably make the tagline for the company. Believe me, this is not Theranos 2.0, but time will tell, and we will see. Maybe they will crack that nut. But Lauren, to your point, you were talking about, what goes into getting a good blood sample. I mean, there's all these funny stories of Elizabeth Holmes she was like, I think she was at Stanford and she ended up dropping out to found this company. And there's all these funny stories of her going to her professors and saying like, here's what my company's going to do. And we're going to change the world. And her professors were just like, I think you might
Can't
be
be
a
done.
moron. They're
Look,
like,
you're 19. You've been here for a year. Like, no.
yeah, they're like, you don't seem to know anything about this, and what you're describing is fundamentally impossible. And she was like, haters always say things are impossible. And it's like, well, no, you just don't seem to know literally anything about how this works. But hey, she's a tough kid. She was enthusiastic, and it looks like maybe there's going to be room at another company for her in the future. Time will tell. You never know. All right, Lauren. Speaking of things that make me upset about you, reasons to hate Lauren, you made me watch a new documentary about the Liver King. So do you want to give us a little intro to why you made me do this, who the Liver King is, what this was all about, and what led to me wasting an hour and 10 minutes of my life?
I apologize because when I found the headlines, I had not seen the documentary. You said you'd started the documentary and then committed to watching it, but I subsequently attempted to watch and could not finish because it was really, really difficult to watch. Ultimately, halfway maybe.
Okay. Yeah, it got slow at that halfway point. It was a tough watch, but go on.
So he was really famous online and doing a lot of shocking things online and had this impressive physique and said, it's because I am eating raw liver and bone marrow and testicles. And so he got a ton of fans and followers who were trying to replicate his nutritional practices in the hopes that they too would have this extremely muscular physique. As it turns out, he was spending more than $11,000 a month on anabolic steroids, and it wasn't about the liver.
Yeah, and it to be clear, an important detail is like, if you told me like, hey, we're going to have you eat this meal and there's liver in it, or maybe even there's animal testicles in it. If it's like a cuisine where that's like a normal thing and it's prepared in a way that is supposed to be some kind of delicacy, back before I was a vegetarian, maybe I'd say, okay, I'll try it. But he's eating these things completely raw. Like, there's something about the temperature and texture element to this that makes it all the more grotesque. So like he's like lifting up a giant raw beef liver and just sinking his teeth into it, or a giant testicle with like membranes and stuff around him and just like trying to gnaw his way through them. It's like literally I would say, obviously, people think vegetarians are like hyperbolic about this stuff, but Lauren, this was nauseating to watch, was it not? Him trying to eat fitness.
It's objectively disgusting. It's horrifying.
Truly,
I'm not
yeah.
doing it ever. It's like some fear factor or some punishment when you're on the game show. It's worse than that, actually.
Yeah. So yeah, Liver King took the world by storm, had this like really deliberate plan, as it turns out, where he was like, I want to do like a social media surge kind of like effort here, a campaign, so to speak, and I want 1 million followers. And so he got with like a company that specializes in that, and it was all built around a pre-existing supplement brand he had in place. And it was like, cool, we're going to do a bunch of steroids, get huge, make a bunch of flashy content, and cause, essentially chaos, pandemonium on the internet where everybody's talking about him. And it worked. I mean, he got on some of the biggest podcasts in the world. I mean, the biggest podcast in the world. It became almost like something that broke out of just the like niche fitness world and into just kind of mainstream common knowledge. And then there was the downfall, right? Where it was like, yeah, I've been taking a tremendous amount of steroids, and of course, anyone who's like loosely knowledgeable about fitness was saying like from the first time they saw him, oh, this is clearly a man on a tremendous amount of steroids, and it doesn't matter what he's doing nutritionally or in terms of training, nothing is making half the impact of the $11,000 a month worth of anabolic drugs he's taking. But anyway, I'd like to hear more, Lauren, about specifically why you hated this documentary on Netflix, because I have some very strong opinions about it, and I'm curious to see if we hate it for the same reason or if we hate it for different reasons.
I think, well, I hated that he got this deal in the first place and that he was the star of it. And it was just this whole display of narcissism that I think it might have been an interesting documentary to tell the story without him. But
Yeah.
it was much more like this biopic on his life that seemed to be kind of written, directed, and produced by him, or at least
Right.
people who that was the weird part for me.
Yeah. So definitely, that was part of why I hated it, is that when it comes to a documentary about a polarizing figure, there's always the question with a documentary about somebody, are we going to do it with their blessing, or are we going to do it without their blessing? And 10 times out of 10, these documentaries are better when they do it without the subject's blessing, because you can actually get into it and sink your teeth in and do a real hard-hitting investigative documentary. This was almost like it almost felt like a PR campaign of the Liver King, like a self-produced thing where he had to own up for things he did, but it was like, yeah, but like, my dad died when I was a kid, so all I knew about masculinity was action movies with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone. So like, are you really that upset that I completely fraudulently misled you for multiple years and built my whole company and amassed wealth based on that? And the answer is, for many people, yes, we are still upset.
I don't feel bad for you at all.
Right.
Not even a little bit.
So, yes, part of it that was annoying was it was like, it was almost more of like so in lieu of an apology, allow me to explain why I've defrauded you. And the explanations just didn't really hold weight.
And he was walking around shirtless the whole time. And
yeah, he doesn't wear a shirt ever. That's not his thing. Another thing that bothered me about it was it felt so contrived.
yeah.
And there were a lot of scenes in it where I first of all, I think it's terrible that he subjected his kids to being in this. Like, normally I would never speak about a fitness influencer's kids in any capacity because I don't want to. They should be left out of it. But he drags his kids out there and as part of this whole circus. But in the documentary, there were all these scenes of him trying to convince the camera, this is just what our family does, man. This is just kind of our lifestyle. And the kids seemed like literally weirded out by this, as if it was their first time ever seeing it. Did you catch on to that, Lauren?
Yeah, I mean, it reminded me of when those family vloggers do stuff, except that when they upload their final YouTube video, they've taken the shot or the clip 10s or 20 times before they actually get the final footage, and they edit out all the parts where the kids are crying and complaining that they don't want to do that,
Yep.
or making bad faces. And so there wasn't it wasn't it felt really planned, but as if they didn't have enough takes to make it
Yeah.
feel authentic.
Yeah, it felt like he was trying to be like, allow me to humanize myself and my family and show you our normal kind of weekly routine. And it seemed very clear to me as a viewer that the kids had never gone through this weekly routine and were just being subjective to this, like, essentially a play that had been written for this documentary, which is very, very odd and very disingenuous. But I think the thing that most got under my skin was I've had the great misfortune of knowing a few people like this in my life, going all the way back to childhood, but severely pathologically narcissistic people who constantly lie. And they lie for sport, they lie as a pastime, they lie as a hobby, and that's fine. Okay, there's going to be super narcissistic people who lie a lot. I accept that as a reality of human life. What I can't do is feign interest in those people's stories. So like a lot of times people who fit that personality will be like, gather round, I'm going to tell you an incredible story you couldn't possibly ever believe. And I'm like, can we just cut to the end? Because I know you're lying and I'm just not interested in the story. Like, this
Yeah.
story would be amazing if I had any reason to believe there was a grain of truth to it. But like, I know you're lying and this story is going to take 7 minutes for you to tell. So can we just not do this? But like, there were parts of it where it was just Liver King talking to the camera and he's like, you're never going to believe this, but the first time I ever ejaculated was when I was bench pressing. And it's like, no, I don't believe that. That doesn't make any sense. It's a highly unusual thing to admit to. It would make no sense that now you are no longer aroused by bench pressing, apparently. Like, what am I supposed to do with this story? Or him going like, oh, back in the day I used to synthesize drugs and sell them. It's like, brother, you're many things, but you're not a biochemist. Like, I just simply don't believe you, most notably because you're a pathological liar, but also because these stories have no plausibility. So as the viewer of a documentary, it kind of reminded me of being by those old friends back in the day where they're like, gather around, I got another one. And I'm like, I just don't want to hear it. Like, I'm not mad at you. I just can't pretend to be interested in these clearly fake stories. And that was kind of how the documentary played to me. Did you pick up on the same kind of feeling, Lauren?
Yeah, it very much seemed like he needed more of a shock value element than really what the story already was. The story was already shocking. We didn't need those other weird anecdotes. We didn't need this, woe is me vibe. We didn't need to see you living this really unlikely day-to-day life of
And he's like, yeah, no, the like, they try to treat it as like a rebirth at the end of it, a totally changed man who now eats fruit. Um, and they show him like walking through these pastures, carving open a watermelon, the whole deal. And still he's just like, yeah, I come over here and I defecate near the strawberries every morning and no one knows that. And it's like, why are you shitting on your family's produce? Like, what is wrong with this man? We need to get into the post Liver King era of fitness and entertainment. And so if this documentary was what it takes for us to turn that page, then I accept it. I just wish that you didn't talk me into watching it because I found it to be, there were like, I would say 30% of it was aggravating and 70% was just boring. And I was subjected to all 100%, Lauren.
well, apologies.
All right, Lauren, let's move on. What do we have next here?
Well, I think we're on kind of a fraud theme unintentionally this evening.
Yeah.
And so our next headline here was a post on Instagram from, do I say their name?
If let's
You don't want to
why
say?
don't you say the post and I'll tell you whether or not we should attribute anything.
Okay, well, I'll
Let's
say that.
not say the name. Let's not say the name. There's enough resources here that we could get sued into oblivion.
I will say I don't think this came from a place of bad intentions, but you have to do better if you're going to accurately disseminate science, which
Yeah.
is another theme. But the post is science says menopausal women burn up to 250 fewer calories per day, which can lead to a weight gain of 8 to 20 pounds. And the message is, you know, you can still exercise and diet, and that's important for your health. But it's trying to be a sciencey post. So it says a 2023 study, the importance of nutrition in menopause and perimenopause, it highlights this statistic, apparently, and also highlights the increased risk of chronic diseases and significant bone loss, up to 10 to 12%. One full deep dive, the paper is linked in our bio. I did want a deep dive, and so I looked at the paper linked in their bio. And this is a narrative review. And the third citation was a retracted paper from the author Eric T. Pullman.
Yeah. When you were telling me about this offline and you're like, guess who they cited? I was like, who? And you started with Eric T. And I was like, oh God, what have I done? And then you dropped the Pullman. I said, oh, good. A known fraudster. Beautiful.
So this is interesting because a couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago, you texted me randomly and you were like, I wonder, are the menopause people citing Pullman? And I'm like, no one would ever cite Pullman. He's a known fraud. You know, he was convicted in 2006 or 2007. Of
Actually,
course they wouldn't be.
And it's like, I'm usually very careful with my language. But like this man committed research fraud to such an extent, he did jail time.
Yeah.
Which is like unprecedented. Like you do not do jail time for research fraud. You get banished to the worst office in the building until they find a way to fire you if you're tenured. But yeah, he really did it.
So he did a lot of research looking at menopause, post-menopause, energy expenditure, body composition, and one of the students in his lab, I believe, is the person who exposed him, and he pled guilty to many counts of fraud. And also, I mean, he was falsifying data, literally making up data, putting it in grant applications, and getting millions of dollars from the NIH to fund this research.
Yeah.
And, you know, we can criticize scientists all the time. We can criticize papers all the time, but this is a complete next level of true fraud, criminal behavior, and many of his papers were retracted when he pled guilty to all of these charges and, as you said, spent time in prison.
Yeah.
However, the papers, although if you look them up, you go to PubMed, it clearly says this paper has been retracted at the top. I don't know why they don't just remove them, because the idea that a 2023 paper is using his data, his false data, or his narrative reviews that are based on his false data are like, what are we doing here? Yeah. That's upsetting. It's really disturbing.
Yeah, and it sucks because like this, I mean, all, you know, a little look behind the curtain. This is the process of doing research, right? So I pivoted. I used to do research that's fairly different than the stuff I do now. You know, when I moved over to Duke University, got into an energy expenditure lab with just kind of a different focal area. And so I came across, as part of a review paper, I was looking at data from a Pullman paper. And that paper is not retracted. Which is really common. You'll see sometimes with these like fraud investigations, some of the papers are legit, some aren't, or big lack of clarity here. Maybe some of them just haven't been revealed to be fraudulent. You know what I mean? And there's always going to be that kind of cloud of uncertainty over those papers. And so I was working on a review paper where a paper by Pullman actually had data that would be totally relevant and worth including in our review. But in the process of digging deeper and deeper, it became clear like these data can't be trusted. These are the exact variables that were being fabricated in this exact time frame, in this exact population in some of his papers. So we had to ditch it. But, when you're playing the game of doing science, whether it's on social media or writing up, new papers to be published, there's, you have to do your due diligence. You have to look into, okay, like this researcher, is there any kind of reason that I should be super skeptical of their work? And because like I prefaced it by saying I'm entering this new area of research, that's why I didn't know off the top of my head Pullman does fraud. Like if I said, hey Lauren, who's the biggest known fraudster, in the field of, nanomaterials, how the hell would you know, right? Like you don't know. So like you've been in this area of research for some time, Pullman, stay away. Like that's not to be trusted. But that was a new thing for me. But you have to do your due diligence. And so, to your point, I've kind of ranted about this. I don't know what the right answer is, but retractions just don't seem to be enough. They don't seem to be doing what we need them to do. Now, obviously, in Pullman's case, he got a little more than a retraction coming his way. That became quite a parade of litigation, and rightfully so. But when it comes to like what we do with this information after the fact, I kind of wrote an article about this maybe within the last year. But there was this paper that came out, and it was really dumb. It was a bad paper. It was a dumb paper. It was clearly a disaster from day one. People immediately were flagging it, saying this is trash. Should not be published. There's clearly evidence of several research improprieties if you just do a cursory scan of the supplementary materials, etc. And so that paper did get retracted. The problem is it took like a year, and the paper itself got picked up on big podcasts, got circulated widely, and reached millions. I think the like digital footprint, conservatively, this paper, its findings reached at least 6 million people digitally, which is a huge readership for any individual paper. Some of the stuff we've published, Warren, like 100 people are going to see it by the time we die. Like you have to be real about it. So, I mean, this paper had a huge impact, reached all these people, and then the retraction itself, you could quantify the kind of digital impression, and it was like it had maybe gotten out to 5,000 people, right? So it's not really the process of retracting a paper is totally insufficient because there's still mechanisms where people are still citing it. The paper with fraudulent data or false conclusions gets out to several-fold more people than the actual retraction notice that is intended to say, hey, by the way, everyone, never mind. So essentially we're propagating these false ideas and they're spreading like wildfire. And in some cases, you're even seeing things like this where they're getting cited a full decade after they've been retracted, which is like that we should be, everybody talks about how, AI is going to change this and change that. The very least we could do with AI is like at these publishers who actually publish the papers, the journal publishers. Could you maybe
references?
Can you maybe run a quick tool and be like, hey, have any of these papers been retracted? I feel like that's the bare minimum you could do, right, Lauren?
Yeah, I think so. This particular post, this is a very hot topic right now. It's a very confusing area, and there's so much mixed messaging, as we've talked about before, around, if you're peri or post-menopause, do you need to do totally different things to lose weight? And we talked about calories in, calories out, quote unquote, not working for women and all of that. And so it is a real shame to put this out there, especially when we actually have large data sets that are not fraudulent, that show we're not really seeing drastically changes over the menopause transition. But I think to transition into a more actionable chat about just burning calories in general, and is this something that we should be thinking about for weight loss? I know this is something that you are well versed on, and we talked about the dieting part of the calories in, calories out, and we talked about some of the other components of resting metabolic rate and NEAT and dietary induced thermogenesis. But when we think about that exercise component or that activity component, there's a lot of chatter and a lot of confusion about, well, should I be tracking those? Or if I'm increasing the intensity and burning more calories, does that shift the equation as one think it should logically? And the answer is not quite. And so I thought maybe we could chat about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting research going on right now as it pertains to specifically how exercise kind of impacts the calories out side of that equation, and to what extent we need to be quantifying our calorie burn, or making small swaps that may potentially move that number a tiny bit. So for example, nowadays weighted vests are the big thing. Back in the day, wrist weights and ankle weights were a big thing. I don't know if those are making a comeback with the weighted vests, but yeah, there's always been a kind of question about how granular should we get when it comes to trying to estimate our calories burned during exercise, and what do we actually do with that number. I have the great privilege of, back in the day during my PhD, I did a lot of research on how human metabolism responds to energy restriction. So specifically when it comes to dieting. And then I spent some time outside of academia, and that helped me really kind of refresh my perspective and watch new research as it came out. And I saw Herman Poncer was publishing a lot of really cool stuff. It really started picking up around 2016 and accelerating over the next, 5-ish years after that. And for context on the timeline, I kind of finished my PhD in like 2018. So I was watching this newer research emerging and unfolding, and I was like, man, this guy's doing cool work. And so that's the lab I work in now. I saw some of this work that was looking at the same kind of questions I had, but from a different perspective. And so where I was looking at how metabolism adapts when we engage in a diet and reduce energy intake, Herman was looking at this totally parallel line of research, looking at how does our metabolism adapt when we decide to substantially increase our physical activity level, or the amount of exercise that we're doing on a daily basis. And what really intrigued me about it was a lot of what we were seeing, they were seeing. And it was kind of just two different sides of that coin. You think about calories in, calories out as kind of like a balance, like a scale. And it's like, okay, well, if you kind of put a little bit on this side, or you lift up that side, it's kind of, they both seem to be kind of doing the same thing in terms of the ramifications of a substantial drop in calorie intake or a dramatic increase in energy expenditure, or I should say, physical activity level. But in either case, what we find is some degree of what we call adaptability, meaning when we decide we're going to diet, for example, we could crunch the numbers and do all the, physics and biochemistry and figure out if you create a deficit this big, assuming nothing weird happens and nothing changes and nothing adapts, you should be able to lose weight at a very predictable rate. And what we find is at first that kind of works, but then it tapers off pretty substantially because your body kind of adapts to that reduction in energy intake. And working with Herman in his lab, we've done a lot of really cool research. I'm kind of tagging on to it, but they've been doing research on this for years now, indicating that our body can actually adapt to, abrupt or very extreme increases in physical activity. And essentially what happens is we just don't burn as many calories as we expected to. And when I say we expected, I don't mean that we just have like completely irrational expectations. I mean, if you had a perfectly calibrated, properly calculated prediction of how much your energy expenditure should go up and how much weight you should lose over time by making a given change in your physical activity level, your energy expenditure is not going to increase as much as you think, and your weight loss is going to be much more modest than you would expect. And so on average, when someone says, okay, I'm going to add an extra 100 calories of exercise to my daily routine, intuitively you would think, okay, I'll burn an extra 100 calories per day. On average, you're probably only burning an extra 70-ish calories per day. Now, on average, that phrase there is carrying a lot of weight. That seems to be highly variable, and we're just at the beginning of kind of unraveling who's adapting more, who's adapting less. What are the specific factors that predict that? Is it age? Is it sex? Is it body fat percentage? Is it physical activity level at baseline? A lot of different factors that could be in play. But the reality is, it's really hard to predict how many extra calories you're going to burn from a given increase in exercise because some degree of adaptation is likely to occur. It seems to be highly variable, and we are not good at predicting yet who is going to adapt more than somebody else. And so as a result, you'll see people who will, or you'll see studies where they'll say, okay, we're going to increase physical activity this much, and it should cause X% weight loss over the course of the study. And usually people are only losing 25 to 50% of the weight that they're predicted to lose in that intervention. And the take-home point is, when it comes to calories in, calories out, we have to be really cautious with what we do with any predictions of how many extra calories we might be burning. So a great example is sometimes people will say, well, if I'm adding, an extra 300 calories to my day through exercise, then I can have this extra little 100-calorie snack, and we're still in the black, to use a, financial accounting term. And a lot of people really overestimate the calories that they're burning. Sometimes they underestimate the calories of that little extra snack that they've added in. And essentially what they've done is made their day a lot more challenging and ended up in the same place in terms of total energy balance. So that's one application. Another application is, please, I beg you, as someone who does research on this every single day, I go into a lab with very expensive equipment. So please take my word on this. When you look at your treadmill and it says you just burned 140 calories, that number cannot be used for anything, period. Do not use it. Same thing goes with the current generation of wearables. You look at your watch and it says, hey, you burned 300 calories during that workout. You cannot really do anything with that number right now. It's very tempting to extrapolate that to your total daily energy expenditure and assume that it's going to free up some calories here and there, but it's just really not the case. And more importantly, it feeds into a really disadvantageous psychological view as it pertains to exercise. It kind of turns exercise into a bit of a wager or some kind of a bargaining deal or transaction where you say, okay, I'll give you this many calories of exercise, I'll get back that many calories of food. And that can really feed into a lot of pathological, psychological processes that are highly correlated with disordered eating behavior. So you'd really want to watch out for kind of leaning into those kind of transactional viewpoints. And so I think the most important thing I would say about this topic, being in, I would say kind of the lab that's associated with this line of research, like in the world, we are very much of the opinion that exercising is one of the most important things a human being can do in terms of taking care of their health, physical and mental health. So a lot of people misunderstand our message and think that we are anti-exercise. That literally couldn't be further from the truth. We are very adamant exercise proponents, but it's important to treat exercise as a holistic health intervention more so than a making you really lean intervention. Now, it is true that people who engage in regular exercise, that does have some positive effects on body composition and weight regulation. It seems to increase energy expenditure some, although not as much as we would predict. It does seem to have really positive effects on appetite regulation. So a lot of times people who are who have excess body fat at baseline and are very inactive, if they start exercising more, they will actually start eating less and have better regulation of their appetite. So it does bring some things to the table in terms of losing weight. Of course, resistance training is critical for body composition, bone health, all sorts of, maintaining functionality as you age. There's no question that it is in your best interest to engage regularly in my opinion, a combination of resistance exercise and aerobic-oriented type exercise. But it's really important not to view it as a rock-solid, highly predictable weight loss intervention because the data simply don't bear that out.
And I'll just add to that by saying there's a lot of marketing around the quote unquote afterburn from certain types of exercises. And, oh, your metabolic rate is going to be elevated post this HIIT workout. And that's why HIIT is so much better than moderate intensity cardio. And what do you think about that?
When we look at meta-analyses that look at different interventions and see how they impact body composition, so looking at, multi-week exercise interventions, usually multi-month interventions, with aerobic, lower intensity work versus high intensity interval training type exercise, we don't see any difference. Like it's extremely minimal, certainly not statistically significant, certainly not practically significant. These interventions, as long as the dosage of exercises is comparable, they seem to ultimately yield similar changes in body fat over time and in fat-free mass over time as well. And so that's kind of the easiest way to start, is to zoom all the way out and say, okay, theoretically, if all that stuff is right, it should result in better fat loss over time. We're not seeing that end result. And then you can kind of zoom in and look at the research on that EPOC, excess post exercise oxygen consumption itself. And what you find is immediately after exercise, it is quite elevated, your energy expenditure and your oxygen consumption, because you just did all this anaerobic metabolism, which from a biochemistry perspective, biochemically is kind of like taking out a short-term loan. It's like we're going to do all this anaerobic stuff and crank out all these different energy substrates, but like we'll deal with that on the back end, and kind of you're going to see this elevation and kind of paying off that loan, so to speak, after the fact of doing all this oxidative metabolism to kind of clear out some of these substrates and metabolites. So all that is to say, there's this huge elevation above baseline right after a super intense high intensity interval training workout, but that actually comes down to baseline pretty quickly. And one of the things that's really tricky with this research is like you'll find papers where they're going to say like, yes, we did find that energy expenditure was elevated 24 hours later. And so you're like, oh my God, I'm like a fat burning machine for a day. And if I do this daily, I'm a fat burning machine throughout my entire life. But what you're seeing is like elevated basically means it's like just this tiny, tiny bit above baseline. At that 24-hour period. So we see this huge spike right after. It absolutely plummets, and it may stay quote unquote elevated, but not to a degree that actually matters. It's like this very, very tiny elevation that in the long run doesn't seem to be panning out in terms of having any unique benefit for fat loss.
And I think the same would go for the weighted vests, and that's why, or the ankle weights or the wrist weights, that's why when we're adding this small amount of additional load and going for a walk, the idea that you're going to get any kind of huge benefit from that is really, really overstated.
Yeah. And also, like, if walking around with a tremendous amount of body mass was really like the silver bullet for weight loss, then it kind of feels like obesity would be a self-correcting clinical state, right? Where it's like the heavier you get, then your walking becomes ultra effective, and now you're losing a bunch of weight, and then it's over, right? I mean, if you wanted to do a study on walking against the largest load possible, it'd be walking in people who have a tremendous amount of excess body weight, and it doesn't seem to be the, silver bullet fat shredding tool.
No, does not seem to be the case.
Yeah, and I think Lauren, one thing that comes up, I think a lot of people might say, Lauren, you're generally unlikable. The internet does not like you. People might wonder why you're being so pedantic and picking on all these people who are just offering humble solutions. And they might say, what's the point of nitpicking and pointing out the fact that this effect is so marginal and unlikely to actually meaningfully benefit anyone? And I think one of the things that goes understated is the best thing that you could do for someone is introduce them to a type of exercise that they enjoy and will do very consistently. And so, like, if someone comes up to me and they're like, you know what, I actually kind of like high intensity interval training, but low intensity, longer duration stuff to me is like torture. I would never give that person a prescription of low intensity exercise. I just wouldn't do it. And vice versa. If someone's like, I could walk all day, I find it to be pleasant, but it's the really heavy breathing, really jarring high intensity stuff, I just hate it. Fine, we can go without that and still get the results we want. But when you convince people that they ought to be wearing around this heavy vest that's uncomfortable and maybe exacerbates pre-existing pain that they might have, or introduces new pain that they've never had, and it creates a situation where they are dreading what used to be a fairly tolerable stroll, you are probably doing more to harm that person's consistency and reduce their likelihood of exercising by introducing this kind of extra wrinkle into the intervention. And there is a legitimate chance that you are providing a net negative impact on their walking program or overall health by introducing an intervention that had virtually, I wouldn't say no, but a very low likelihood of upside. And the only real upside would be if wearing the weighted vest gets them so jazzed about like, oh, this is going to work so well that they actually can tap into some extra motivation. But in terms of actually doing something physiologically, very, very minimal likelihood that you're adding anything to the equation.
That's the thing. I'm not anti-weighted vest. If you want to wear a weighted vest, then go for it. All physical activity is good. My issue is everything you just said, and I'll add to it by saying there is a tendency, especially for people who are not yet regularly active, to try to pull at these small straws that don't actually involve doing the thing yet. And so it could be, I need to get the right running shoes and then I'll start running. Or, well, I need to join the gym and then that'll make me start going. If I order the weighted vest, it's going to get me to start going for walks. And that's not the right message, because that sort of behavior very, very, very rarely gets people to actually engage in those behaviors consistently over time.
Yeah. Now, Lauren, there's one last thing I want to mention about energy expenditure, if I may.
Okay.
So
I'll allow it.
We talked a little bit about menopause and energy expenditure and all the lack of clarity and uncertainty and confusion, and people saying it's going to go down 250 calories a day once you hit menopause. And Lauren, just from my knowledge, what's the kind of going average age of menopause these days?
Around 50, 51.
Yeah, around 50, 51. So a really great paper. This doesn't count as self-promotion because it's not me, but I mentioned I work in Herman Pontzer's lab, and he published a paper in 2021 in Science, which is one of the more prestigious journals in the world, to the extent you value that kind of thing. But it made a lot of noise because it was a really cool paper with, I think it was 6,000 or 7,000 subjects using doubly labeled water, which is the gold standard for assessing total daily energy expenditure. Age range was from literally like infants to people in their mid to late 90s. So it was like the entire spectrum of humanity with a giant sample size using a gold standard measurement for total daily energy expenditure, which captures your resting metabolic rate, your exercise, everything. And it was looking at many different questions because that's the hell of a data set. But one of the questions was, does our metabolism really slow over time? And what they found was throughout most of adulthood, starting at the age of 20 onward, it stays pretty stable until it starts to taper off a little bit. And they basically found that the age at which it starts to taper off a little bit is about 63 years old. And what they found was that the trajectory at which your total energy expenditure changes throughout adulthood was not altered by biological sex. And so when you look at the lack of an effect of sex, and when you look at the overall age range at which it starts to taper off, It tends to correlate more with changes in lifestyle, changes in your physical activity level, downstream changes on your fat-free mass, which happen to occur in older age, around the time where we just generally shift to a kind of the retirement phase of our life, are doing less physical activity, are maintaining less muscle because we're not moving around and challenging our muscles as much. This is generally when we start to see total energy expenditure dropping, and that happens in males and females alike. So when we zoom out and just look at, give me the highest quality number we could get for total daily energy expenditure across many cultures, multiple thousands of people in this sample, it just doesn't look like we're seeing this. What I would assume you would kind of predict based on this whole idea that menopause is causing this massive drop in energy expenditure. We would expect that right around 50, 51, you start to see a divergence, right? Where males just kind of keep on trucking and females have this really big, downward blip in terms of energy expenditure. And frankly, we just don't see that. And so I think my overarching kind of take home message from this chat, which I think has been good in my opinion. Of course, we've been talking about some of my favorite areas of research, so a little bit biased, but what's really important is that you're going to see a lot of these claims like, hey, when you hit menopause, your energy expenditure is going to drop 250 calories. And it's like, yeah, you could play that game where you decide, I'm going to dig into the literature and read all the references and find out that some of them have been retracted. They're probably fabricated data, blah, blah, blah. Now I'm reading about what kind of jail sentence this guy got. Or my preferred approach, which is you zoom out and say, okay. But if that were true, then blank, right? And we can kind of look to some of these other areas of research where, like I said with the EPOC question, okay, fine, yes, EPOC is elevated for 24 hours, you're a fat-burning machine, blah, blah, blah. But if that, then we should see an advantage for fat loss in these big meta-analyses with trial after trial after trial, and we don't, right? And so that definitely causes us to say, okay, now we don't have to get into the weeds of all these mechanisms because we know it just doesn't pan out for the thing we actually care about. Same thing goes, like we could dig into these 12-week studies that happen around the time of menopause or these cross-sectional comparisons and blah, blah, blah. Or we can look at these kind of longitudinal studies where we say, if there were this kind of massive drop-off around menopause, we should be seeing this drop around 50, 51, and we're just not. So heck, you make whatever kind of theory you want, make it as convoluted as you want. Maybe there is a drop in resting energy expenditure that's counteracted by a completely equivalent increase in some other facet of energy expenditure. Very unlikely, but at the end of the day, what we're looking at is total daily energy expenditure, and we're not really seeing it move around that time frame. We're not seeing the type of big picture outcomes that would be compatible with that mechanistic type of kind of cause and effect relationship.
And to your point, if there are people who are promoting a claim that, this happens and therefore fat loss or therefore fat gain or therefore muscle loss, the paper they are citing should have fat loss or muscle growth or muscle loss as the outcome. It shouldn't be about energy expenditure. It shouldn't be about some mechanistic pathway. It shouldn't be about rodents. It shouldn't be about the hypothalamus. It shouldn't be about speculative appetite regulation and nutrient sensitivity. You need to see, did these people lose fat? Did these people lose muscle? Because if not, then all that tells us is, that's interesting. We need to do a lot more work to figure out if something's there. Because if it were there, we would have more than one paper showing that intervention with that outcome, and it would be very clear.
Yeah. I think a lot of the pseudoscience we run into on the internet, even from people who are highly credentialed, almost exclusively among people who are highly credentialed, a lot of that pseudoscience, it really does come down to there's kind of like the question of, has this been observed is question one. Number two is, does it matter? And number three is it actionable? Can we actually do anything with that?
Yeah.
And a lot of the pseudoscience that we see and a lot of the claims that we end up talking about on this show, they completely stop at the first question. has this been observed in any context, in any capacity? But that's not really interesting until we address question at least 2, which is, does this matter? And there are some things that do matter, and we can't really do anything about it, but it's better to know than not know, right? But if you're not even getting to the second question, let alone the third, what are we doing here? So you have to have research that actually closes that loop if you want to say that a particular intervention is evidence-based, because by definition, if you're intervening, you are implying we can do something about this, which theoretically also implies it matters enough to bother doing something about it. So again, that 3-question series, has it been observed? Does it matter? And can we do anything about it? A lot of times people are just hanging around that has it been observed thing and then making up the whole trajectory of what that should mean and what we ought to do about it without any evidence to actually close that loop.
And inventing a solution which may or may not even be relevant to the first part.
That is correct. But, Lauren, we could be cynical. We could be negative. And I think that's why people hate you on the internet. But I choose to look at the bright side and say, think of all the content we can create. It's like a perpetual game of whack-a-mole where pseudoscience is popping up in more places than you could possibly hit with a single mallet. Metaphorically, not condoning violent mallet strikes, but it does often feel like a game of whack-a-mole, and they're coming up quicker and quicker by the day. So at the very least, never a dull day in the world of debunking some of these claims.
Well said.
Yeah. All right, Lauren, I think that does it for today. Any last words you want to tell the good people until we take our weekly 7 days between episodes?
Yeah, if anyone comes across a crazy headline, a funny headline, an interesting post, DM me, Dr. Lauren CS1.
All right, yeah. DM Lauren. And of course, have you been checking the email for the show?
I have been checking the email. I figured it was easier to DM. If you'd like to email us, frontpagefitnesspodcast@gmail.com.
Yeah.
You just get a request for the link for those geriatric pants.
Yes.
And we've had a few other... The sandwich question came in an email.
Okay, good. Yeah, because I knew it existed, but we had never actually talked about who should be checking that. I've never looked at it. So I'm glad there's not like a, list of 100 urgent emails. That's good to know. But yeah, we will get out the link. Remind me to put that in the show notes for this episode, a link to the pants, the geriatric pants. They are made in China. I hope they haven't been just shot to the moon in pricing due to any tariff policies or anything, but time will tell. Everyone, thank you so much for tuning in to yet another episode of Front Page Fitness. If you like the show, please be sure to support it in whatever way you choose. So you can certainly like, rate, subscribe, review, share it, tell a friend, and spread the word. And hopefully we'll see you next week for another episode.